Hi, Mike. Hi, everybody. Just want to check you can hear us in the London room.
We can, Richard. Just checking you can hear me.
We can indeed. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, everybody. Hey, Charles, we are just at the top of the hour, so thanks for joining. Hopefully you can hear me speaking. We're going to just give it one more minute to allow people to join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? So I am Mike Ward with R3, and I'm going to be your host for the Architecture Working Group today. We have a couple of things to cover, so thanks everybody for joining us. The agenda for today, so a couple miscellaneous things that I wanted to cover off just on how you can observe the group, etc., ask questions. David Lee is going to take us through our sub-working group updates. So for those that are not familiar, the architecture working group that you're on now is the main working group. We actually run a series of smaller working groups with our member banks that cover specific topic areas. So David Lee is going to bring a summary of that to everybody. Gavin is going to talk about Corda 2 what's happening with Corda post 1.0 release. So he's going to talk to the specifics of that, also the process that we go through on that, and what you can anticipate in terms of naming and other aspects. Richard's going to talk about Corda Enterprise today. So I believe that you may have heard of Corda Enterprise. Corda Enterprise, Richard first had talked to it at the CordaCon event in London. We're going to talk in a little more detail on that and tee up a whole series of conversations we'll have on the specifics of that in the coming weeks. And then last, I'm going to talk about the Enterprise Preview Program, which is a way that for those of you that are interested in actually getting your hands on Corda Enterprise as we develop it, you can get access to the bits and provide us feedback. So first order of business is a little bit of housekeeping. So I want to remind people we actually are streaming live on YouTube also. So if you have trouble accessing the Zoom, I guess you wouldn't be listening to me now if you had trouble accessing the Zoom, unless you're also listening on YouTube, but that is an option. So all of the sessions, including this one, will be up on that YouTube channel. And then we'll also upload those back up on the Vimeo channel also for those who cannot access YouTube from their organization. So you can see the URL there, Corda YouTube bit.ly link, if you wanted to go up to the YouTube channel for the next session. So if you have any questions, unfortunately, we're using a webcast style now just for better management and a better experience for everybody. But you can put questions into the window, and I do have the panel up for Q&A, and we'll try and pause people and get your questions responded to. We'll go through each section at the end of it, pause momentarily, and see if people can type in questions. And then if there's things that you all want to hear more about, please let me know, mike.ward@r3.com, and we're happy to work that into the agenda. So just Corda in the news work. We announced a project that is running with our member banks. You may have seen this in the news. So 22 banks cooperating in an international payments project. So we'll actually have more details on that and try and bring some people to talk about the work we're doing there into the architecture working group, either in the next session or the session following that. So we wanted to acknowledge that as it just occurred 2 days ago, and let you know that we'll get some people to talk in more detail about it. So next up, I wanted to pass it over to David Lee. And David, I'm going to let you take control from your side. And David's going to talk to the sub-working group updates.
Thanks, Mike. Actually, I think Joel is holding the pen, so if we pass control to him. Bear with us for one moment. Mike, I'm sorry. Could you possibly run it off your screen, and we'll talk to that if that's okay?
No problem at all. Yeah, absolutely. Let me bring this back up. Okay, David, you can just cue me, and I'll move to the next slide.
Will do. Thank you. Okay, so hi, it's David Lee here, and I'm going to give you an update on one of our sub-working groups in particular. This is the Security Architecture Sub-Working Group, or SWG, as we call them. For those of you who are not familiar with the SWGs, as Mike said, these are smaller groups consisting of members of our R3 consortium members. In particular, the security one is a select group of security experts from 9 of our member banks, together with representatives of us from the R3 side as well. And the objective of that group is really to give us a panel that we can call on to provide opinions and guidance on specific security considerations around the design of Corda and the design of networks which will use Corda effectively. So it's obviously a really important topic that goes through everything that we do here. We've actually been running this now for some time. We've been running since July, and we've had 8 sessions to date. And in each of those sessions, which we've run in a fairly workshop type format, we've taken the time to make sure we really go deep into the heart of Corda's design and really try and analyze the implications of certain design decisions from a security perspective. And on the next slide, I'll give you a flavor of the kind of things we've been talking about quite recently. please, Mike. Yes, so in our discussions, we're generally quite flexible about the approach that we use. We make use of different frameworks for analysing different topics as they seem to fit our needs. But one of them which has been particularly helpful has been the CIA triad, which will be familiar from anyone working in information security, as a common way of classifying the security requirements around your information assets. So the CIA stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So you can see we've got these three pillars here. And what we've done for each of these pillars, first of all, we set about trying to define a sensible classification system, a way of categorizing different data assets that may move around a Corda node or a Corda network in terms of their confidentiality and their integrity and their availability. And that in itself is already a very useful outcome, because that gives us a model that we can use to develop clear policies around how we think those things should be protected in each way. But beyond the pure classification and the taxonomy, it's also provided a great platform for us to discuss the implications that naturally come out of thinking about it in this way. So if I go through each of these in turn, you'll see what I mean. If we look at the confidentiality dimension, first of all, this is the most obvious one that people think of when they're thinking about information security, the need to restrict access to information, so ensuring privacy. This, as anyone who's familiar with Corda's design will know, goes right to the heart of what Corda offers. But in drilling down into the confidentiality dimension, we've been able to cover such topics as the appropriate use of encryption, the appropriate way that various data assets can or should be distributed around a Corda network. We've been looking at where data resides, be that at rest on hard drives in different locations or in transit on the wire. And we've been looking at authentication. So that ties very closely to the concept of the identity framework within Corda, how we certify participants and authenticate that they are who they say we are. Equally, we've talked about permissions management. So that includes such topics as the potential need for directory services like LDAP as integration features within Corda, and revocation. So how you go about removing actors from a network if you have a need to do so. So each of those in it by itself, very, very meaty topics which come under this general banner of confidentiality. There's clearly not time to talk about all the different findings that have come out of those topics here. Obvious things that come out, one, there's different types of confidentiality you need to think of. The most common confidentiality frameworks that we started with were very much looking from a perspective of a traditional enterprise, trying to define what is allowed in and out of the organization. And that's a great place to start. But actually, when you expand the scope to an entire Corda network, you see it's more complex than that, because you're considering as well what data is appropriate to be distributed from one node to another, so from one legal entity to another. And that leads us to some very interesting conclusions. We talked about the need for some form of directory services support. Beyond that, we have uncovered a number of other potential needs to be able to restrict how data moves around, but they tend to vary on a case-by-case basis. And for more detail on that, it's best to look. Those of you who are members of the consortium will have access to the detailed notes, which will give you some insight into that. If we move on to the integrity perspective, so integrity is really about making sure that the data is accurate. And you could argue that on at a very high sort of macro level, maintaining the integrity of data is the ultimate purpose of distributed ledgers in general. So acknowledging that, we wanted to drill down into more specifics around Corda's design, and some of the topics that we talked about beyond the obvious ones around how notaries work and how our consensus mechanisms work in general for Corda were how we mitigate database corruption. So how we make use of appropriate enterprise class databases and the mechanisms they already have to ensure resilience of data. Also how we do versioning management, in particular ensure that versions are resilient to any potential changes in database schemas that may occur through the evolution of Corda apps and Corda as a platform itself. And we recognize that we need to provide more transparency, in particular on how some of the notary mechanisms that we're developing may look to work. So we've had some really useful conversations around the integrity dimension as well. And then finally, on the availability side, so this is clearly about having timely and reliable access to information. So the concept of high availability, and by extension, disaster recovery, separate but related topics, have come up quite regularly in our recent discussions, and we've acknowledged the need to make sure that both nodes which run Corda as a piece of software and services provided to a Corda-based network, like our notaries and our network map and our Dorman services, all have appropriate mechanisms in place to ensure that they're highly available and they have provision for recovery in the case of an unexpected outfall. So we've explored the use of various different technologies where we can, for example, make use of existing mechanisms like CDNs, which are very efficient and cost-effective ways of distributing data in a resilient way. We've talked about how we use database replication as an important mechanism. And we've also talked about the importance of making sure that the mechanisms for nodes to ensure they have all the data they need to assert the validity of their transactions and keep control of it and keeping care of it are things we've been talking about. So already you can see that just under these three headings of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, all under the subheading of security, we actually end up discussing a broad section of the architectural implications behind the design of Corda itself. And it's produced some really interesting outcomes for us. You can move on, please, Mike. What's going to happen next? Well, now that we've been doing this for some time, I think we're a good few months in, we have a fairly good sense of how our methodology is working out, what's working well and what could stand to be improved in terms of how we analyze security considerations. So we're going to be refining that a little bit, and the members will be in a position to see how that works. We also need to start more formal kinds of scrutiny around the various security frameworks and documentation that we are looking to deploy around services provided by R3. So our network in particular, what formal structures have we got into place to ensure their security, and how do we evidence that through documentation? And that's something else that we would expect to go through the security SWG. Beyond the above, we see there's a clear appetite to start moving away from the purely abstract aspects of Corda's design in a general sense, and looking at specific case studies. So how Corda is being used as part of a solution to be implemented for a specific problem, and what we can learn from that specific use case, which we can then take back into a general sense. So this, I think, will allow us to have more and more productive output from this working group going forward. That's my update. Any questions, let us know. Otherwise, over to you, Mike.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. And if there's any questions, you can put them up in the Q&A, of course, or the chat window. So preferably the Q&A, actually, that they're a little easier to manage. So thanks, David. So next up, we're going to have Gavin Thomas talk about Corda 2, actually what's occurring post Corda 1. So for those of you that are not familiar with Gavin, Gavin is the person that keeps things in order around here and is the person who would be closest to the releases. So Gavin's going to take us through what's coming and the process we get there. So Gavin, I can do slides from my side, or I can pass over to you.
Hi, Mike. I'll let you move the slides if that's okay.
No
and thanks for a rather exaggerated description of what I do here. Yeah, so Mike's done the interest. Let's skip to the first slide. And I want to just spend a couple of minutes describing how we deliver Corda and how we've adopted what is a fairly typical agile delivery framework. So if you skip us to the next slide, please, Mike. Thanks. Yeah, so agile inspired, and really we're following a typical agile approach, and we're doing that because it gives us the flexibility to adjust our focus and adapt to the customer-driven requirements. Two good reasons why agile's become so popular within the software industry, and with the blockchain space remaining to be, excuse me, with the blockchain space remaining to be such a stimulating backdrop. We need to make sure that our delivery approach allows us to react to such a fast-moving landscape. So this means that we also break the rules slightly on what is a typical textbook implementation of Agile. So we have what we call champion developers, and they would own a particular feature so that we can have the depth that we need to build successful and complex solutions. And we also find that where we've got multiple smaller teams concentrating on particular features, we like to give those teams the freedom to apply a delivery framework which suits them. So actually, we've got quite a mix of Scrum-based teams, Kanban teams, and it's quite tough to label how the teams operate on a day-to-day basis, because really it's a framework that they've chosen themselves. And I think that's come through the evolution of the platform team since it formed over 18 months ago. And we keep quite a small dedicated QA team. So where in the past we've seen QA teams that would take a handoff from the developers to make sure that that code is passing, we've chosen to put the emphasis for the responsibility of the QA testing back to the developers. So we've shifted the responsibility of testing to the development team, which means our QA guys have more time to be more efficient around the testing, so using automated test suites and improving our release cycle and making the release process less arduous, which means that we can release more confidently each time. And we also work hard to prevent the build-up of technical debt. We do that by having dedicated time to clear that debt and giving the development team the freedom they need, again, to knock those to-dos on the head. And achieving a good delivery, it's really about having a good team of deep knowledge by hiring high-quality developers, but also encouraging them to peer review in quite an unforgiving way. So we're even talking down to the suitable use of full stops in bullet lists. That seemed to consume a fair amount of time amongst the development team some months ago. I think we've reached a conclusion on that one now. And we also try to give the actual development work the focus that it needs to get done, which means that we don't have lengthy planning sessions. So obviously we have the cadence of planning sessions and retrospectives, but we try to keep them short, sweet, and to the point, so that the guys can crack on with the coding. And we give the guys time to think. So we make sure that the development team have the opportunity to actually step away from the desks and just have time to think about the complex solutions and come up with solution proposals that they can share with their peers. And I think it's important that we continue to create that culture. Next slide, please, Mike. And this next slide really just picks up on the couple of points around making sure that we are actually maintaining quality, because some of you may feel uncomfortable with the concepts of a small dedicated QA testing team. But the red boxes here are indicating that by having the champion developer taking ownership for a particular feature, it means that they've got the depth of knowledge to make sure it's covering the feature actually covers the requirements properly. And then onto the peer review. And then once we're into the build, obviously unit testing becomes a key part of any pull request from a developer. And again, another peer review picks out any final niggles, and then we're onto a merge and a done. So it's quite a short cycle, but the key points around maintaining the quality means that we're not having to compromise on the quality of the code. Okay, so that's delivery. Let's move on to the future versions of Corda then, please, Mike. Okay, so Corda version 2. So aside from the bug fixes and enhancements that are coming up, we've been listening to customer feedback following Corda version 1. And a key change that we've picked up on for version 2 is going to be the support for observer nodes. So where we had the feature where using that is relevant, so that you could share transaction information with external parties, for example, regulators, we're now using a slightly modified version, and it's called the observer feature. You can look forward to that and we have adjusted a familiar demo, the interest rate swap demo, to be able to demonstrate how that observer feature works. So as soon as version 2 is available in the coming weeks, we would strongly encourage you to take a look at the interest rate demo, interest rate swap demo, and familiarize yourself with that observer feature. And post version 2, so we continue to commit ourselves to the usability and the robustness of Corda, which means we're picking out 2 more challenging goals for us that we're going to be achieving in future versions. So wire stability. So where we've achieved API stability for Corda version 1, we're now expanding to achieve wire stability for the messaging compatibility between Corda and future versions of Corda. And similarly, application binary interface, or ABI stability, so that Corda have binary compatibility between future versions. So it's really hammering home the developer productivity that Corda provides by making sure that future versions of Corda do not break your Corda, which means that your continued investment and effort to build Corda is time and money well spent. And you know that future versions of Corda deliver enhancements and bug fixes, but they don't break your Corda that you currently got either in pilot or in a future production implementation. And of course, along with our openness around the development of Corda and the design of Corda, we'll be updating the technical white paper, and it's going to capture the latest design, the latest thinking, and we'll be very pleased to be able to share that with you as soon as those updates are complete. I'm actually going to now pass on to Richard to just talk a little bit around the way the versioning numbering is working.
Thanks, Gavin. So just a quick comment. Some of you might be wondering why we're about to jump straight from version 1 to version 2. We've put quite a bit of thought into this. We've observed, and you will have all observed platforms in the past that release a version 1, and then Java is probably the best example of this. It then stays on version 1 through multiple major enhancements and releases, and 15 years later, it's still version 1.x. So we've taken inspiration from the Android API and some other platforms, and taken the view that actually if we add a meaningful API, so not obviously we're not breaking APIs, but adding new APIs, where we add a meaningful one, we'll bump the version number. So what you'll actually see is dot releases will be bug fixes that are backwards compatible but add no new features, and integer increments when we've added new APIs. And as the support for observer nodes, when that comes out in a few weeks, adds a new API, we bump the version. So we're going to experiment with this. So you may see some iteration on it, but don't be at all surprised to see Corda very rapidly cycle through 2, 3, 4, 5, and get to quite a high number quite quickly. Trying to hide functional improvements in dot releases kind of doesn't strike us as the way forward. It's Corda 2.0 coming very soon. Quite a modest increase in functionality, although a whole ton of other bug fixes and other features, other fixes behind the scenes. But you'll see the numbers increase quite rapidly rather than hiding everything behind a decimal point.
Thanks, Richard. Back to you. Thanks, Mike.
Excellent. Thanks, Gavin. Thanks, Richard. So in fact, it's going to be back to Richard. So Richard's going to introduce us to the next level of detail around Corda Enterprise. Again, we did mention Corda Enterprise and our intention to build this product back at CordaCon. So we wanted to start discussing actually what we're building, the process about how we're building that, and then I'll talk briefly at the end about how you can actually gain access to that. So Richard, I'll pass to you, but I believe I should probably drive the slides, it sounds like, so I'll try that.
Yes, please. Yeah. Cheers. Thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone, again. So just a bit of background on this first. So I guess I was just talking about 30 seconds ago, we shipped Corda 1.0 last month. Corda 2.0 will be out later this month. And as you know, Corda is fully open source and free to all, and it is our intention for people to widely adopt Corda as is happening and to successfully go live with it. But what we're also seeing is, as you'd expect, and several of them are on this call, but more broadly, we have a large number of large companies, enterprises, who are looking to go live with Corda. And they have some quite unique and, in many cases, bespoke requirements, both a need to pay for support with committed SLAs, but also some specific features that are in reality unique or targeted to large-scale enterprise deployment, often based on the nuances and then just the practical reality of getting IT deployed in large financial institutions. So we, as was always the intention, we started work on the enterprise branch of Corda, which will be the version that has some features targeted for those use cases, which will be available for charge with SLA support. So how are we thinking about this, and how are we going about it? So the first thing is, and as I was hinting at, there are some specific and very sort of very common feature requests we're getting from these large customers. So whether it's a desire to be able to integrate with existing enterprise technology, we never use the word legacy, but let's be open about what we're talking about. There's a lot of heritage technology that is in many cases unique or bespoke to large companies. And given our vision for Corda is, it becomes the point of truth for a firm's records, books and records, the point of truth for the existence and nature and evolution of contracts and deals it has with counterparts. There is a lot of tight integration with existing enterprise tech that we have to be able to support, and some of that necessarily needs to be in the enterprise version. That also ties into the fact that the deployment environment of many large institutions is actually very complex and has some very specific technologies that we have to be able to integrate with. And so the way we're deriving these requirements is from this second box here, which is specifically requirements derived from partners and projects. We're working with a very large number of end users and partners who are building on top of Corda, and that's how we're finding what they want. And examples would be not just integration with hardware security modules for key management, but very specific versions of specific vendors' products to be used in a specific way, as an example. Similarly, databases that are unheard of or just not deployed in the open source world, but which are just preeminent and adopted entirely in the corporate world. Doing the work necessary to integrate and support them is a key enterprise feature. So that's what we're doing. But there's some key principles that we're adopting, which the last two pictures on this chart are intended to indicate. And the key one that I'll point out is that we're focused on compatibility as a very high priority. And in particular, one of the principles we're working on is applications written for the open source version of Corda will be able to run unchanged on the enterprise version. So we don't end up with this forking, which would be in nobody's interest at all. Of course, the opposite isn't necessarily true. If you take advantage of enterprise for its non-functional features, then fine, those applications will run just fine on Corda open source. But obviously, if you take advantage of specific API, specific features that are unique to enterprise, then obviously that code won't run on open source, and that's what you'd expect. So where are we focusing for the first batch of work and for the developer preview at the start of next year and then the release later in the year? So the first is on performance. So we're already doing a ton of work on the Corda open source release to make it perform. But if you look at the deployment on premises at large institutions, they use hardware that's quite different to the scale-out hardware you see in public clouds and elsewhere. So it's a performance work tailored to these the unique hardware characteristics of some large pieces of kit are something we're focused on. We talked about hardware security, not just specific HSMs, but also enablement for some aspects of the Intel SGX work that needs to be in the enterprise version. But a lot of work is focused on how do we support mixed networks of nodes where some are running SGX and some are not. High availability and disaster recovery is something I want to talk about. This is something I've written about and probably should write about some more. There's a belief pervasive in a lot of the blockchain community that the blockchain technology obviates the need for a backup or disaster recovery strategy. What I hear all too often from people is, well, it's fine, my node's on the blockchain, if the node gets blown away, I just recreate it and it can just resync to the blockchain. But of course, the reality is, even with public blockchains, that is nonsense. I've got a blog post coming out in a few weeks on a different topic, and one of the lines I wrote in that was, you show me somebody who's running a Bitcoin or Ethereum node on the public Bitcoin or Ethereum network, who has no private data that needs to be backed up separately, and I'll show you somebody who doesn't have a business model. The reality is everybody has private data that has to be backed up, and it's even more so in the enterprise or permission blockchain space, because even if you could recover your shared data from peers, where's the contract that says they're obliged to do it, and where's the regulation that says they're even allowed to? So you do have to worry about how you back up and recover your node in the event of different types of failure. And it's something we've thought about from day one in Corda, and something that I think some of the other enterprise blockchains will have to grapple with at some point, to the extent they haven't already. But there are lots of different ways of implementing that. You can have hot cold, hot warm, hot hot. Massively almost a microservice approach where there's no single point of failure. Lots of different models, and some of them rely quite deeply on existing technology that are deployed in banks, synchronously replicated databases and SANs and so forth. And the enterprise version will be focused on making sure we can take advantage of what is already deployed and working well in those institutions. And then, obviously, you'd expect integration with management and monitoring tools deployed in large enterprises, taken as a given, and there's an ongoing piece of work that we'll do on that. And then the final thing is, and we've not talked much about this in public, but when you look at what deployments of Corda nodes will look like, uniquely, Corda allows multiple different applications, different networks of nodes collaborating to solve a business problem, to be deployed on the same Corda network. But to do that requires some additional management features, and the parties who will deploy those applications typically have specific knowledge in a particular area, and we're working very closely with several of them to understand exactly what features are needed in enterprise to be able to support their ability to manage those networks. So watch this space on that. There's more coming. The net is we, as we just mentioned earlier, are continuing to push out releases of Corda open source. Corda 2.0 is coming out in a few weeks. There'll be a 3, 4, 5, a huge amount of functionality and non-functional improvements. And then in parallel, and you'll see the first drops of this code at the start of the year, the enterprise release for large-scale enterprise deployments, which is something that lots of people are clamoring on our door for, and which we'll be shipping soon. Final point, and then I'll switch back to Mike. We are working with all the firms we're aware of who need this product, who are committed to go live, who need production support and need these enterprise features. If you're one of these people and we don't know about you, please get in touch with us via Mike. And the product management team works for Mike, and they're the people who are prioritizing these features, making sure they're on the backlog of the teams that Gavin manages, and making sure that we're delivering what people need when they need it. So do drop a note to Mike and make yourself known. Okay, thanks, Mike. Back to you.
Thanks, Richard. And before I go to the next slide, I will mention it is mike.ward@r3.com was the email. That's on the first slide. So feel free to drop me a note on that. We would love to understand what you're trying to do with Corda. As was mentioned, and it's fairly cliche to say, I understand, but it's very true that we are discovering most of our requirements by working with partners and customers right now. So it's really important to us to understand how people are using the product, because it's really helped us understand what to build and how to prioritize. Each of these categories that you see here, we will do a separate AWG session on in the coming months, so coming weeks and months. So we'll dig a lot deeper into each of these sections and bring the engineers who are working on each of these areas into the AWG call to talk about the plans there, what we've done to date, and hopefully, if we're far enough along, some demos or at least architectural reviews. So this is effectively the contents for the future AWG sessions. So the final point is how you can get involved. So we love to get the input of other people, other stakeholders who would like to actually get their hands on Corda Enterprise and provide us feedback and help provide direction. So we will have up shortly on the Corda.net site a private preview program that will kick off that eventually will open up fully public. So we're looking in the Q1 timeframe for an early release on that, but of course we are in an agile process, so we're going to release that private preview when we believe it is ready. So, but we are eagerly anticipating that. So we'll put a form up there. If you give us your information, then we'll start putting people into queue who we can open up access to get your feedback. So we'll also use that same form, by the way, to communicate out some more details by a newsletter for enterprise as things start taking more shape and we can share more and more detail. So I will put that up on the homepage. Link will be up momentarily after the call for you to register. So that is.
Actually, I just see a question, Mike. Are we planning to do any more 1.x releases? From Rob. Actually, we were until we realized that we could. So let's just take a step back. This observer node is relevant thing. We should probably spend a minute or so on. I think Ross talked about it a couple of weeks ago. When we shipped 1.0, so that's the point at which we stabilized the API. We removed support for the irrelevant check because it doesn't interact well with some privacy features. But of course, we knew at the time, and we know now, some people rely on that. So we've been prioritizing adding the replacement feature that does interact well with the rest of the design. We were actually able to get that done sooner than we expected, and because it adds a new API, rather than ship it as a 1.x release with some bug fixes, we're going to ship it as 2.0, which removes the need to actually ship any 1.x releases. So the next release will actually be 2.0, and that will include accumulated bug fixes since 1.0. Hopefully that answers that question.
So 2 other questions. One from Atis Jane about, is there any way we can get the outcome of these subgroups calls shared with interested people? David?
Yes, I did respond briefly on the chat, but we're definitely looking into that. There's an awful lot of good content going on in the SWGs, a lot of it at quite a level of detail that's not actually useful for seeing the outcomes of those discussions. So we're looking for the most efficient way to syndicate the good bit. One of the ways in which we'll be looking to do that will be to feed into the forthcoming updates to the tech white paper, which I'm sure will help to articulate how the design of Corda has moved forward and what the rationales were for that. So look out for that in the near future, and we'll see what else we can do on the side as well.
Great.
And it looks like there's a question from Charles as well. Hi, Charles. Well, obviously IBM's MQ is widely used at large financial institutions. Yep, MQ, a platform close to my heart, the very first product I ever worked on when I was at IBM. But IBM's appliance is a piece of actual hardware that runs MQ and used by our large European bank customers, so it's important and considered enterprise to us. Yes, so I'm not sure what the question is, so it's certainly a statement.
Actually, Charles,
I agree with that.
Had a different question on that, Richard. I'm sorry. That was the second part of it. I had answered it previously. He asked if we'd looked into supporting integration to IBM's MQ appliance.
Right. Okay, sorry, Charles. Okay, fine. I missed the context there. Yes, I don't know that we have in particular, but my hope is it would look just like a regular MQ series queue manager from the perspective of us. But if it's something you want to, this is a perfect example of something we want to get into the product management process. So yeah, Charles, you've already got our email addresses, so don't hold back. Drop a note to me on Mike Ward, and let's follow up offline.
There are 3 other questions, actually. Let's see. Is there still consideration of Hyperledger and Corda collaboration? And Richard, I don't know if I can take that one if you want, or if you'd like to take it. In a broad sense, I will address it in the sense that we are members of Hyperledger currently. We're fairly active in the groups, and in fact, I was just in their booth at Sibos recently. So we definitely continue to collaborate with them. I think Hyperledger at this point, a lot of what our interest in is their original mission, which is when they start looking at the interoperability aspect, et cetera, which we're eagerly anticipating. But I'm not sure if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, just a couple of things. So totally agree with what you just said, Mike. And for those who don't know, because I know we have a lot of new attendees on this call, R3 is a premier member of the Hyperledger project. We've been part of Hyperledger since the start, but the Corda code base itself is not in Hyperledger. It's managed on Corda.net. But our governance process and our licensing is exactly compatible. So in many ways, it's a technicality, and I can go, if anyone interested offline, I can go into some of the reasons for it. But it's not massively interesting. But in terms of collaboration, yes. So if you look at just as one example, if you look at the performance working group of Hyperledger, you'll see there's an R3 solution architect who's very active there. So that working group is looking at, how do we get to a point where we can talk meaningfully about the performance of different platforms? Because if you're going to have a metric such as transactions per second, you need to be able to determine what a transaction is. And some of the thought leadership there is actually being driven by an R3 solution architect, Guy, who may be on the call. So yes, we are in, we work closely, but as you all know, of course, Corda and Hyperledger Fabric are very different and are not the same code base. But we work very closely with Hyperledger as an overall project. Another question, any plan to make it easier to learn code and verify programs in Corda? The biggest hurdle isn't in the Kotlin language, but in how to do it right. There are lots of APIs and lots of concepts. After we write something in Corda following the examples, it's hard for us to verify it as expected, e.g. what's written in the vault, which party, what info is in it, and so forth. Well, silent so far is Joel from Developer Relations. So over to you, Joel.
Yeah, hi, everyone. So yeah, it sounds like what you're looking for is our test framework. So we've got two test frameworks we've developed. And one of the big reasons we developed them actually is because it can take a while to set up a node. So when you start a new node to test an app, then obviously you have to start a whole Java process. A lot of things have got to be put in place. So very early on, we recognized there needed to be a way to test whether a Corda app was working as expected without actually starting a node. So you had turnaround times of seconds rather than minutes. So we've got these two test frameworks. So one's the contract testing framework. So basically, you can take a contract and create dummy transactions, and then for each transaction, assert whether that transaction should pass or fail verification. So you can build, you can basically spec out all the transactions you want to pass, this verify all the transactions you want to fail, and then you can test, and normally it takes about 10 seconds to run a suite of maybe 100 transactions through it and just check that your contract's rejecting and accepting the right contract. And the other one's a bit more interesting, and that's the mock network. So basically, we've got a node on the Corda network is really just an interface that's implemented to actually run Corda. But we've also got an implementation, which is the mock implementation, which is a node that does everything a normal node does, but it's designed to be very lightweight. So they can all run in the same process. They can run with very lightweight databases, stuff like that. And using the mock network, what you can do is write flow tests. So you can basically run flows on the node. You can check what's in their vault. You can check what's in their transaction storage. So it's basically just a way, again, of unit testing a flow. So, for example, you could write a flow that you expect to put something in transaction storage and vault of node A and B, but not of node C. And then you could write a flow test where you basically run that flow and then check what's in each node's vault. So the best place to learn about these is, it depends how you learn. So if you go to docs.corda.net/tutorials.html, so if you go to the tutorials section, the sidebar, there is quite a long tutorial on how to use the contract testing framework and how to use the flow testing framework. And if you're if you want to learn by seeing it done actually, then you can just go to one of our Corda apps. So if you go to corda.net/samples, most of those will have flow tests. So if you go to the IOU Corda app or the obligation Corda app, perhaps on that page, that will be on either if you go to corda.net/samples and find it there, or if you go to the Corda GitHub page and look for the Corda app example there, you'll find it. And basically, if you look in the tests that accompany the source code, you'll see examples of testing contracts and testing flows there.
So Joel, I'm going to put you on the spot. Can we get a short, doesn't have to be massively polished, can we get a blog post out in the next day or so that just says, hey, you've written an app, here's some tips and tricks, basically what you just said, here's how to test it. So saying to, hey guys, did you know about the mock network? Did you know about this? Just almost just sort of like all the stuff that's in your head and almost your workflow, how you go about testing it, saying, guys, it doesn't have to be a fully fleshed out tutorial. It's just, did you know about these things? And this is how I test it. Just something clear. I think it could be quite useful, because I think more people will find that useful.
Great, yeah, perfect.
Thanks.
There is another question about, do you plan to write books or ebooks about your products? I think potentially individuals have plans around this, and it has arisen. I think at the moment we're really mostly focused on ensuring that we have good documentation, tutorials, and other things to help you guys that are freely available online. So. However, I can't promise that I'm looking at it. Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, it's a good question. We have debated this. We've actually had a couple of publishers approach us and say, do we want to work with them to produce a Corda book? And it's been, to be completely frank, it's Richard here. It's been me who's been pushing back. I've just had experience in the past of books being written on new platforms before all the, or at least before some good practices and experience has been developed in production, and repeatedly. And what happens is the books are either out of date before they hit the bookstores, or they actually contain advice that turns out to be naive or misguided. So what we're doing is, on public Slack, on Discourse, on Stack Overflow, documenting things as we go. We've got our training, which is available both online and in person, which takes people through worked examples. And the thing that you'll begin to see as our professional services team does more and more engagement with clients, they'll be capturing experience from the field on what works, what doesn't, and feeding that back through tech notes and documents on the website. So yeah, it's something we think about. I just don't think it's quite ready. I don't think it's quite the time to do that. What's the future of Corda Explorer? It's quite limited as a demo tool, showing info about the cache class. How about OT? Make it a general browser of everything in Corda. Don't know what OT means. So a couple of comments there. So first of all, you're right. Corda Explorer, the Node Explorer, right now only has the Cache app installed by default. You can actually drop other jar files on it and install other Corda apps. But, and this is dependent on the class carpenter work that Kat is working on, and which I think she presented on a few weeks ago, we need the ability to automatically create the Java classes representing transactional state types that the Corda Explorer doesn't know about, and that work hasn't been done yet. If anybody wants to do it and submit it as a pull request, we'd be delighted to receive it. It would require you learning a bit of Java FX, but that's no bad thing. We would like to extend that, but you're right. Right now, you can drop more apps in, but you need to. There's a bit of work, and we need to make it a bit easier. So it's fair feedback. I would like to prioritize putting more effort into it, but it's not on the schedule right now. We're fully focused on 2.0, 3.0, and Enterprise. Yeah.
And we have no open questions. I'm just going to check the chat window actually to see if there's questions. Unfortunately, Zoom has two areas to ask questions, so there's a few in the chat window. I'm just going to read real quick. Can we have the tech white papers have more diagrams than words? Always helps. Yes. I think this is an easy one to take back to the team as feedback. I think a picture is worth 1,000 words is the cliche, and that's definitely true. And I believe that's it. Outputs in the sub-working groups. I think David already talked to that one. And Charles is asking where the blog is. The blog, Charles, the easiest way to find the blog. Unfortunately, the site's
no. Mike, it was. I think it was a specific question about the blog that I asked Joel to write on testing. Is what I think the question was about. But I just put Joel on the spot and asked him to write it. It does not yet exist, but it will do in the next few days.
There you go. Okay, excellent, easy. No, Charles says no. So I think, Charles, are you looking for the blog itself?
Oh, sorry, Charles. Sorry.
So the blog, I don't believe is actually linked. I don't have the site up in front of me, but if you scroll to the bottom, you'll see a link to all the postings for the blog. So we'll try and make it more obvious with a little site cleanup there. So the blog, the Corda.net, and scroll to the bottom and you'll see the latest blog postings. So that's where you'll be able to link to it from.
Yeah, we should. And here you go. You can also go to corda.net/category/blog, and there's actually some good content there about how we're looking at certificate revocation, how we're thinking about upgrades, our use of continuations in the JVM. If you've not looked at it, there's actually some pretty meaty content there that everyone working on Corda should be paying attention to. Thanks, Clement.
Excellent. So thank you, everybody. I think since we're out of questions, we will finish the call. Charles says he found the blog. That's good. Thank you for the questions, by the way. It makes it much more interactive, which is the intention of the session. So hopefully we'll actually block out a little more time in the future so we can do Q&A continuously. So thank you for your time, everybody. This video will be available on YouTube. The URL down below. Please send mike.ward@r3.com if you have any topics that you'd like covered in the future, or if you're working on projects that you'd like us to be aware of. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.